Time for another update for the Pro and the free LITE version of the dust particles asset. This time we've got some looping directional wind and a curve flow. The curve flow for now we put in the experimental section. We've got some more sprites like the paper just shown and some leaves too, among a few other features, so let's get into it. Whether you use the Pro version or the free LITE version, you'll see there's a difference with the UI. Thanks to some updates in Blender 4.1, things can now be organized a little better. The geometry nodes group layout can make use of Blender's user interface panels within the modifier, so we can collapse and expand different sections and keep it cleaner overall. Within the Pro version, there's all these extra sprites, so we've now managed to take advantage of the asset browser and create some icons for them all. If not using the asset browser, you can just copy and paste using Ctrl-C to copy, and then in the target blend file, use Ctrl-V to paste it in. That's one way to get the dust particles asset into your scene. If you are familiar with using the asset browser though, you'll already know how to take advantage of that, but for anyone else wanting to use the asset browser or for a refresher on using it, what you'll need to do is have the dust particles pro blend file along with this text file, which holds the category info in the same folder. You can put that folder wherever you want to keep it. Here I'll just use a folder called dust particles. Then I'll go to the user preferences under the file path tab. There we'll find the asset library section, click the plus, find the folder, and then just select it. That's all there is to it. Then all we need to do is open up an asset browser and then find the dust particles category. Without that text file I mentioned, that's also in the folder, the assets will probably just show up in the unassigned section. In any case, once we can see them in the asset browser, to make use of them, we can simply click and drag what we want into our scene. Something important to note on both the LITE and the Pro version is the camera section now looks a little bit different. Rather than manually selecting the camera here at the top, thanks to another Blender 4.1 development, the asset will now just automatically orient the particles towards the active camera. That's great for when using multiple cameras. So if I have two cameras in the scene, I can select the camera I want, and with the mouse cursor somewhere in the timeline window, just press Ctrl-B. That will create a little camera icon which binds the camera to that special marker. Then when we scrub through the timeline to a point we want a different camera to take over, we do the same thing. So select the camera, then Ctrl-B in the timeline. Then scrubbing through, we'll see that the cameras switch and the particles stay oriented correctly. If for some reason you don't want the particles to stay tracked to the cameras, then we have this checkbox to be able to disable that behavior altogether. I'm going to leave that enabled though and collapse this section. Alright, so we've got some other changes for the free LITE version that we'll go over in a moment, but the main change for this 1.2 release is in the Pro version, and it's all to do with flow. This was probably the most requested feature. All we have to do is enable it and we'll see the particles travel in the X direction at the moment. The higher the value, the faster they travel. And it should still loop seamlessly too. It probably makes a bit more sense to stretch out the domain, which is just a cube at the moment. So I'll tab into edit mode and then press SX4 to scale out along the x-axis. Then let's take a look at the edge fade. This simply makes the particles fade out as they near the point that they loop around to the other side of the domain. It'll not bother fading it on any other axis. It's just fading in the direction they're traveling. If we do set them going in another direction though, then it'll start fading out in that direction as well. Again, that should all loop around seamlessly, but a quick note, if you do want it to loop seamlessly, just make sure to use a rounded off value like 1 or 4 or whatever. If you use 1.2, for example, then it's not going to loop perfectly. So I've just been keeping it to whole numbers. We can get a pretty cool effect just using the axis pointing towards the camera. In this case, that would be the y-axis. We can get a sort of fly-through effect with a bit of a longer domain down the y-axis. Here I've used that idea for another sort of starry deep space effect. I've just coupled it with a lens distortion effect for extra warp vibes. Feel free to dig into the project file which comes with the asset if you want to take a closer look at the settings or any of the other examples you see here for that matter. Another requested feature along the same lines as the wind is to have the particles flow along a curve. We've got that currently in an experimental section at the bottom. You'll need to create a curve and then select it in the pull down. You can use a curve which loops around like a circle or a figure 8 or whatever looping shape you want. The particles by default will loop around the whole curve, which simply means when a particle reaches the end of the curve, it'll jump back to the beginning of the curve again. For other shapes though, you can also just tab into edit mode on that curve, make sure all the points are selected, and then just press X and delete the points, and then use the draw tool instead and draw out a different curve, for example. We can still make it cyclic by right-clicking and choosing that option if we wanted, or switch the direction for that matter. But I'll just keep this example not cyclic though for now. Speed is how fast the particles travel along the curve. The length setting is how much of the curve you want to spread the particles along. How much of the space on the curve are the particles always going to be occupying. So 100% means the whole curve. 50% would be half of the curve. The distance is how far away from the curve the particles can get. So with a really low setting, they're really hugging the curve. And with a high setting, they're really free to spread their wings. The travel style is by default set to loop, which is why the particles start again, or in other words, loop around when they get to the end of the curve. Ping pong means the particles switch direction at each end of the curve. We've got an easing version of that too, which just means it'll slow down smoothly on each end before switching direction. Maybe though, the most versatile out of these is the manual setting. That's going to allow us to manually place the particles along the curve. So 0.5 would be halfway. Also, it means we can animate that field and get exactly the kind of speed up or slow down or back and forth that we might want. We've added some more sprites as mentioned, namely the leaves and the papers. These seemed like good sprites to add to complement the wind. In both the Lite and the Pro versions, we've got this new domain section. To keep things more organized, we've put domain related things together. So in the Pro version, that's where you'll now find the option to use a custom mesh shape for the particles to spawn within. We've also moved the spherical fade option into there too, which you'll also see in the Lite version. If you need them to fade at the edges in a more boxy way though, rather than a sphere, we've now got that option. You'll find that in both the Pro and the Lite versions. This boxy edge fade is good for longer domains. It mostly works in the same manner as the sphere fade. The size is that area where the particles are fully visible. If a particle goes beyond the size we've set here, the particles are just immediately going to become fully transparent and look like they blink out of existence. That's why we have this other fall off slider, so that on top of that fully visible area we can set with the first slider, we can add beyond that a more gradual fade. As we increase the edge fall off, the larger the range will be where the particles fade from fully visible to fully transparent. In the Pro version, this should respect custom shapes too, by the way, which is what we're using on this glass curvy tube of some unknown physicochemical formula here in this project file. As the tube is quite narrow, the size is set quite low, so there's only a small range in the very center of the tube that the particles can be fully visible. Then, so that the particles don't just pop out of existence at the edge of that size that we've set, we've also got a little bit of an edge fall off. We just need to be careful about setting these values too high, as otherwise the particles will look as if they appear outside of the tube. We could have just reduced the distance the particles are allowed to travel away from the curve, but we like the look of their movement in this example with them set a bit wider. And so this way, using the edge fade, we still get to preserve the general movement style that we liked, even though it does push some of the particles beyond the boundary. There's one more section I'd like to point out, which is this point rendering experimental section. This has also been added to the Pro and the Lite versions. In Blender 4.1, you'll only notice the difference in cycles though. In Eevee, we'll get no result in rendered mode. In the upcoming Blender 4.2 and above though, we should get something in both cycles and Eevee. It's intended mostly for cycles though. With it enabled, we can use the little spheres as points in the viewport. So you're getting a very optimized rendering of a 3D sphere object basically, and it should all still work with the rest of the system. Color, hue, saturation, size, the domain fades, and so on. When we just use the diffuse only on these points within cycles, we'll see that nice smooth sphere effect. We even get shadows cast from the other spheres. As mentioned, with this version, we've included a few more demo project files, so you'll be able to see the exact settings we used on some of these examples. And that's to go along with a load of the other project files that are still included from previous versions, of course. If you have any feedback for us, requests, or any of your own examples you'd like to share with us, hit us up in the comments, or the socials, or Discord, or whatever you like, and we'll see you out there.